Can you introduce yourself and tell me about your story with OCD?
So, my name's Rosie, and my story with OCD is relatively new. And when I say that, I was only diagnosed with OCD about 2 years ago. But I'd say that it's hard to say, but my experiences of OCD have been long before that. So, I'm one of 5 children. I work in the mental health industry, and I've got a background in psychology. And yeah, I think I've always been passionate about mental health, and talking about it, but particularly with receiving a diagnosis of OCD, I've become someone who wants to shine a light on it and build awareness around it.
When did it click that you potentially had OCD or a form of mental health condition?
I've described myself always as being, an anxious person. And lots of people probably describe me as someone who is really, quite a deep thinker, thoughtful, and always thinking about others and being very mindful, which of course you always think are beautiful qualities and real strengths. But some of those qualities have also been very agonising for me. That thoughtfulness or that deep thinking has led to quite a lot of anguish, internal anguish, and internal agony, I'd call it. I think I've known that I've probably been experiencing anxiety and mental health issues for a long time, and seen health professionals for a long time, but it wasn't until 2020 I saw a psychiatrist, and I was formally diagnosed with OCD. And it was a confronting experience, but it was also a relieving experience. I think for so long I had experienced thoughts and worries and things that I couldn't quite understand. And when I got to a point where I'd had a really difficult part of my life, and really I felt as though I'd had nothing left to lose at that point. And I saw the psychiatrist and just said, these are the thoughts that I'm having. And for so long, I held those thoughts because I was afraid of saying them out loud. And these are intrusive thoughts. And for fear of what it would mean if I said it out loud. And the psychiatrist said to me, you're experiencing intrusive thoughts. And a session later, I was diagnosed with OCD. When he said it to me, I was bawling. I was crying on the couch, I remember. And he was really gentle and said to me, I feel as though I've upset you and I'm sorry. And I said, no, it was, I know what you're saying is right. And as he explained to me why he had the rationale of coming up with the diagnosis of OCD, it was like he was picking up pieces of my life and my thoughts and my emotions and behaviours, which I now recognise as being, obsessions and compulsions. It was like he was taking the muddle of my mind and putting it in, all the pieces of the muddle of my mind as a puzzle and kind of putting it all together. And it made sense. Like, I knew what he was saying was right. I knew at that point I had OCD, but it was confronting. And but at least I had an answer. And, you know, I had a reason for why these things were happening to me, because for so long I didn't know that. I didn't understand why I was having certain thoughts. And I remember being on the phone when times were really difficult. I'd say at my most difficult time of OCD, and being on the phone to my sister and just saying that I just don't feel like I've got control of my thoughts, and I don't feel like I understand my thoughts and why they're happening. And that was really scary. You know, the thought of not having control is really scary, I think, for people. And I just said, you know, it's getting to the point where I just think I need to have an admission to hospital, or have some kind of intervention. And, you know, remember saying to a friend on the phone that, you know, what's wrong with me? Why am I having these thoughts? I can't make any sense of this. And that was when I saw the psychiatrist. So, and he gave me a diagnosis. So I think that was my lowest point, I think, of OCD. And I really got to the point where I really felt like I didn't have anything else left to lose. I knew something needed to shift. I knew something wasn't right, if that makes sense.
What do you wish somebody told you about OCD after your diagnosis? Like, what did you have to learn the hard way?
So I think I was really lucky in a lot of ways when I was diagnosed, because I had a really good friend that I also knew had OCD. So I went to them for support. So I feel so eternally grateful to that person that they were both there for me, and they were so open with their experience, because it really helped me understand and feel validated and not alone. I think that's a really big thing with any health, be it mental health, physical health, or life experience, really, that you know that you're not alone in it, and that there are other people who have shared in that journey with you. I think I wish that there was I wish someone had said to me, I wish it was picked up by a health professional earlier. I've been seeing health professionals, and when I say that, I've been seeing psychologists for a long time, GPs. I wish it was picked up earlier, and I think that's a really important thing that needs to change in the health sector. Not enough psychologists really understand OCD, and for a long time I was probably labelled with a whole lot of other diagnoses or potential diagnoses, and treated for those things like anxiety or depression, but was never quite getting there. I could never quite get to feeling, you know, myself or good, and it was really frustrating. So I wish that there were, at the time when I was diagnosed, that there was clearer information about what OCD is, but also where to get help. And there were people that said this to me, but I just wanted someone to say to me that you're not a bad person, that just because you're having these thoughts are not you. Your thoughts don't define you. And that sounds really simple. You know, you can say to someone, well, just because you have a thought doesn't mean that you want that to happen, or it doesn't mean it's real, or it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. But that's the thing with OCD. You know, there's that thought action fusion that you fear because you're having a thought, and as I still do, fear that because I'm thinking this thing, it means I want something to happen, and therefore I often determine that makes me a terrible person. But often people who have everybody has all of these thoughts every day. We have thoughts about multiple things, not just people with OCD, and 99% of those thoughts are just meaningless. And people without OCD can let that go. But for me and many other beautiful people out there that also have OCD, they can't let that go. So I wish, if I had my time again, and for anyone else with OCD, to remind people that don't believe everything you think. And just because you're thinking something, it doesn't make you a bad person.
How would you explain OCD and what it's like to someone that doesn't understand it or know anything about it?
The way that I'd explain OCD in a non-clinical way is an experience of having constant thoughts, sometimes distressing thoughts. And everybody has hundreds, thousands of thoughts every day. So, and a lot of those thoughts can be meaningless or are meaningless. But for people with OCD, we latch on to a lot of those thoughts. And it's almost, you imagine it like those roundabouts that mice run on. It's like that, you know, a merry-go, just around and around and around. So that becomes an obsession. So whatever your brain latches onto, if you've had a thought, and often it's the cruel thing about OCD is it is often things that you really love and care about and value that your brain does latch onto and starts to sabotage. So that will run over and over in your mind, and you really can't stop it. And as a way of desperation to stop this madness making sort of loop that's happening, you create behaviours, or they can be overt compulsions, or they can be behavioural compulsions. So mental compulsions, are one that I can really strongly relate to. I have a lot of mental compulsions where I'll try to think my way out of a thought, and write things down and try to loop things together. But then there can also be behavioural compulsions whereby you may have I have a touching wood compulsion when I have particular thoughts. As you can probably imagine, that's fairly disruptive to someone's day-to-day life. For someone who experiences really severe OCD, they can be experiencing compulsions and obsessions for up to 7 hours per day. So if you think about it, that's, really almost a full working day that someone is trapped in this cycle of agonizing thoughts and, behaviors or mental compulsions to try to escape from that agonizing experience. So that's a way that I could describe the experience of what OCD is like. But what you probably can gather from what I've said, OCD is exhausting. It's really exhausting. And it doesn't stop. There's no break from it. So, I can go to bed, and quite often that's the time. And I think a lot of people can relate to this, but your brain thinks, oh, perfect, there's nothing happening. This is the perfect time to start worrying about all of these things that you have absolutely no control over in your life and try to problem solve, at 2:00 in the morning, the anxious hour, like this is the perfect time to solve all your life worries. There's no break from it, really. But what we know, or what I've learned, and what my psychologist and the research around OCD says, is that unfortunately the compulsions can give relief temporarily, but it only exacerbates the cycle. So you'll have some temporary relief from whatever that obsession is. It's so that compulsion neutralizes the anxiety or experience of that obsession. But the cruel thing about that is that it's sort of temporary relief. It actually makes it worse, because your brain gets this information that, like, I figured out a way to stop this. And of course we're going to go for that. Like, of course, everybody would. And I think that's an important point too, that a lot of people feel a lot of shame around their compulsions. But when we think about that, like, it's totally natural that people are going to develop certain behaviours or mental compulsions to try to neutralise that anxiety, particularly if they don't have strategies around effectively managing it themselves. So I guess I want to say that too, that people can often feel really ashamed, or like they haven't, they've gone backwards in their OCD recovery journey because they're completing compulsions. But I guess I would just, somebody said to me that don't be hard on yourself for completing those compulsions, because it's just the way you had to manage at the time. So not being hard on yourself for that.
How does OCD affect you day to day?
So I think I'm pretty lucky in my OCD experience, in that I've been diagnosed with a milder form or level of OCD. So I feel really grateful for that. That means that I'm able to work and have relationships and do a lot of the things that I love doing. The way that OCD affects me every day is, it's an interesting question, because I feel every day I've been described as a deep thinker, or someone that is really thoughtful. And I've always attributed that to being strengths and trying to be true to those things, because they're important to me in my life and in my relationships. But at times, day to day, that can be quite crippling for me, because I'm constantly worried about, have I said something to offend that person? Or did that person feel supported by me? I remember in a partner that I had years ago, when we leave a conversation, I would agonise over what I'd said to that person and how I'd responded in the conversation. And I'd seek reassurance from him, and I would say, do you think what I said was okay? Do you think I upset them? And he would, and understandably that was really frustrating for him to continually hear. And, Rose, it's fine. I don't know why you're worried about that. I don't know. So, regularly I, over time, have gotten that kind of feedback from people about, when I'd leave a conversation and I'd be concerned about things that I'd said, and be thinking about that for days or weeks. And people just saying to me, I don't know why you're thinking that. And that then leaves me, now I know why I was thinking that, because I have OCD. But at the time, people would say things to me, just let it go. Don't worry about it. And if it was that easy, let me tell you, I would have done that. and still now, but I couldn't let it go. So those sorts of things happen to me every day, you know, and I try to work with that every day. One of my concerns is obviously around being conscientious towards people and being caring and ensuring that people feel loved. That's an important value to me. One of the things that I do and have done in the past, and I can laugh about it, is that if I would see someone in the street and I knew them, I couldn't drive past. I had to either park the car and get out to say hello, because I was concerned that if that person knew that I'd driven past them and didn't acknowledge them, that would be upsetting for them, or they would feel like I thought that they weren't an important person to stop and acknowledge. So this has led to, you know, quite hilarious situations where, you know, I have found myself driving around, you know, if I think I've seen someone I know in the street and I've driven past them, that obsession, you know, taking hold of me, and the compulsion being that I have to go back and I have to find them and I have to stop and I have to say hello. So I know it's hilarious. And I think that's another thing about OCD. You know, it is awful, and a lot of these thoughts are really difficult, but it's also important to sometimes find the humour. And I know it's ludicrous. I'm driving and I'm saying to myself, Rosie, this is ludicrous. Why are you driving back trying to find this person? They're not going to think that you're a terrible person, but I think I'm a terrible person if I don't do it. And the thought of someone inflicting that feeling on somebody else is far too much for me to manage. So I'd rather drive around looking for them.
What's the most challenging aspect of the illness in your eyes?
The most challenging thing I find about OCD is that it's really misunderstood. And I think OCD is also really undermined. You know, there's lots of times, you know, day to day, I'm out and about and hear people say, oh, I'm so OCD about my cupboard, or I'm so OCD about cleaning my bathroom. And, you know, if that person has OCD, then I feel for them, you know, what that experience might be like to have to keep things very orderly. But I think, again, that's one of the stigmas about OCD, that everybody who has OCD is either obsessed with contamination or keeping things perfectly neat. And in actual fact, there are so many subtypes of OCD that, you know, more than I can even possibly name, and more to come, more that we don't understand. And so that's not understood in the community. And like any mental health issue, it's hidden. So for a lot of people that I've spoken to and said that I have OCD, they are surprised and they say, you know, you don't seem like someone who would have OCD. And I know that comes from a really beautiful place of people acknowledging me for who I am and not my mental ill health. But again, I think that speaks to a lack of awareness or understanding about how OCD can present. And there's probably so many people in the community walking around that actually have undiagnosed OCD, that live with the internal agony of these obsessions and thoughts and compulsions. And because for me, a lot of it is mental, I would describe, you know, a lot of my obsessions and compulsions, a lot of the time being mental ones. That's really, people can't observe that. And one of the things about having OCD or having any mental ill health diagnosis is that you get really good at masking it. You get really good at being able to be normal or ensure that people don't know that you're experiencing these things. And it's just a learned behaviour, I think. I think one of the other really challenging things I find about OCD is the impact of that on my identity. I think I've struggled, but also, and still do, I'm still trying to learn about, you know, my own journey with OCD. But I remember feeling really unsure of who I was when I was diagnosed, because all of the obsessions and compulsions that I had were attributing to this conscientiousness or this kindness or level of hyper responsibility that I feel for other people. But it also aligns to what my values are as a person and what's important to me. So I have found it really hard to differentiate, well, what part of my personality is me and what part of me is OCD, and am I just a fraud? You know, am I just someone who's only doing all of these things because I have OCD? So that's something really hard that I live with every day, and what that looks like in terms of my everyday is questioning myself and questioning why I'm doing things all the time, because I'm trying to decipher, well, is this Rosie making this decision or is this OCD? And you can't separate them, you know. OCD is a part of me. And I had a really beautiful friend, one of my closest friends. Makes me emotional thinking about it, because I remember I told her that I had OCD, and I explained to her some of the obsessions that I had and this internal struggle that I was having around my identity. And the way she responded was so beautiful, and I'll never forget it. And she just said to me, Rose, they might be the things that you live with OCD, but they're also the things that we love about you, and that's what makes you who you are. And I hadn't thought about it in that way. And it was really disarming. You know, it was sort of like, doesn't matter. We don't care. We don't care if you're doing those things because of OCD. Like, I see you for more than that. You're you, and OCD or not, we love you.
So you mentioned how like other people don't really understand it and they joke about it. What do you wish you could say to people that joke about OCD?
For people that joke about OCD or use it in a throwaway line, I like to think that everybody has good intentions, and I firmly believe in kindness. So I would kindly try to say to people that I know what you're saying may not have this intent behind it, but for people who have OCD, and I'm one of those people, using it in that way really diminishes my experience of having OCD. And I know that's not what you're trying to do, but I just want you to know that. And I know I'm telling you that because I know that you're better than that. It happens to me, like as I say, I work at a mental health organisation, and like I was in a meeting the other day and someone said it, you know, with 40 people, and like that's in a mental health organisation. So like it happens so much, so regularly, that I kind of just feel like, and I suppose that's what Penny and I are trying to do with OCD. Like,
What would you say is the biggest misconception about OCD?
The biggest misconception about OCD is that everyone who has it is obsessed with contamination and germs and, can't step on a crack. Or also that they're incredibly tidy. I can assure you, if you saw my work desk, my car, my room, you would very quickly learn that I am a tidy person. I think that OCD is quite often thought as being that. I think that media and movies have really portrayed it in that way, which has been, quite unhelpful. I also think that OCD, one of the biggest other misunderstandings about OCD is that not a lot of people have it, or that it's a really nuanced mental diagnosis. But I would actually argue that there are more and more people, coming out talking about having OCD, and that it's something that is not very well understood in psychology and psychiatry. And I can say this as someone who did a psychology degree. We focused very little time on OCD. So my concern and what I feel really passionate about is getting the word out there about OCD and people getting the right support, because I really don't think that there's either the risk that there are a lot of people out there that are either misdiagnosed with other things but actually have OCD, or people who are undiagnosed and worrying that they are so worried about having these thoughts and they don't understand why they're having them. They're too fearful to approach a health practitioner around it. And I think another misconception around OCD is that, and that of any mental illness or mental ill health in general, is that it's debilitating and you can't live a good life if you have it. I'd really challenge that idea. OCD, with the exhaustion and all of its challenges and the barriers that it places in life, and the trauma, I think, as well, that it can bring. It also makes for a person who is so grounded, thoughtful, understanding, and brave. I think I'd really like to challenge that idea that if you've got OCD, then you're not, if people were thinking, well, if I've got OCD, I just don't know what hope I've got of living a good life. Like, you can live a fucking good life. Like, you just have to get the right help.
How does OCD affect your day-to-day motivation?
So day-to-day, OCD affects my motivation. It can depend. The experience of OCD for me can be very fatiguing, because I will have a lot of mental compulsions, and it's almost like when I wake up in the morning, it starts, the thinking. So that's just constant. So if you could imagine kind of going through the day with like that background, plus going to work, plus, I don't know, a world pandemic that we're in at the moment, plus whatever else is happening in life, that mental load is really exhausting. I think the other way it can affect my motivation is that because I have trouble sleeping, I've never been a good sleeper, always. Like when I was younger, I had insomnia. I also had chronic fatigue. So, now looking back on all of these things, crystal ball, maybe some of those things are linked to OCD. But I really don't feel like I get a lot of rest because it's all just go, go, go in my mind. I think that it's my motivation, it's a tricky one because I think my experience of OCD is also that I have a level of hyper responsibility. Like I take over responsibility for things. So even when I'm feeling exhausted, I will keep going because I can't cope with the thought of letting someone down or not doing the right thing. And of course, then that has physical impacts on me as well. So overextending myself, I think, is in some ways OCD is helpful in my life. You know, it's really interesting. I'm someone who is really active, love sport. I've played basketball my whole life. Love running, love anything to do with sport really, and very social. So in a lot of ways, this, you know, being go, go, go all the time has been helpful. But again, it's like that saying whereby your strengths become your enemies in some ways.
What do you wish you could tell people that don't have OCD?
Be kind. Anyone, be it OCD or any person really, doesn't discriminate. I think kindness is the thing that we need more of in the world, and understanding and being patient. You don't know why someone's behaving in a particular way, or you don't know what that person's day may have been like. So I think defaulting to kindness is the way of people actually coming together and understanding one another. I think it's very easy to become judgmental or make assumptions about why someone is behaving or speaking in a particular way. But if we can kind of disarm ourselves or the way that we might initially typically respond to that, and just respond with curiosity and just say, you know, hey, I don't know what to say, but I want to talk to you about this. I work in the mental health industry and I've probably been guilty of saying this as well. I just didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Or I was worried that I would say the wrong thing. And I think for anyone that doesn't have OCD, I would, approaching someone that does, I would say, you don't have to get it right. It's better to actually try and get it wrong, because that trying, or someone trying to understand or caring and having kindness and compassion for you means more than saying the right thing. And as human beings, I think having that kindness and compassion in any situation is the thing that ends up bringing us together and building more understanding about people's experiences. Times where people have said nothing or felt as though they couldn't say anything, they're the more difficult times that I remember. And I've been really fortunate in my experience. As I said, my friends, my family, my work colleagues, most people know I have OCD, and I've been so supported by everybody. So I've been really lucky in my experiences, and I'm truly grateful for that. But I know that there are times where people haven't been and been stigmatized. Rather than saying nothing, say something and get it wrong. Be courageous, because the shame that you can feel as a person with OCD, with someone not saying anything, is awful. It's awful. It's awful exposing yourself and saying that you've got OCD and someone not saying something. And it just makes the shame worse.
What advice would you give to others currently experiencing OCD?
For people that have been newly diagnosed with OCD, I would say that you're not alone. I have OCD, and there are lots of other people out there that have OCD, and there is support, and life can be better, and you don't need to live with whatever excruciating thoughts or behaviours that you're having. I would say that find someone that you really trust and can be completely honest with, a friend, a parent, a grandparent, whoever, and talk to them and tell people. You know, there's a saying that shame can't survive empathy. The experience of not sharing your experiences of OCD is so crippling and so shame-inducing. Just, if you can be brave and just share it, be that via conversation, or write a letter, or write a song, or write a poem, or whatever it might be. Do an interview. Just share it as best you can. And it's bloody terrifying. And I'm not saying it's not. I remember having those conversations, and it's terrifying. I think also for someone newly diagnosed and going to tell people, I think be prepared. Be prepared with what you're willing to share and what you're not. It's also okay to not share everything with people if you're not quite ready for that. And I think being prepared and having control over your story is really important. I remember telling my parents that I had OCD, and I wrote notes before I met with them and talked to them about it. You know, and I'm not suggesting that people have to do that, but for me, I needed to feel prepared, and that helped me have that conversation. So I think for people that are newly diagnosed and other people with OCD, I would say you're not alone, and there is support, but you just got to find the right supports for you.
Do you feel there's a stigma around taking medication for mental health?
I do feel there's a stigma around taking medication for mental health. I feel like stigma for mental health is getting much better across the board. I think the experience of COVID has been a really equalising experience for the community, in that everybody don't think that there would be a person out there who would say that COVID's been a breeze and mentally hasn't felt exhausted or challenged by it. So I think there's stigma around medication in two ways. I think one, that people might think that they don't need medication and that they're afraid of taking medication. And I can relate to that. I'm someone who has always preferred natural medicine, and really resisted taking medication. And it got to the point when I was at my lowest point with OCD, now I acknowledge it was with OCD, that I'd tried everything else. I'd had therapy, talk therapy, so different psychologists, all of these things, and nothing had gotten me over the line. And so I agreed to take medication. And for me personally, it helped. Yes, it doesn't take away having the obsessions and the compulsions, but it took the edge off me being able to manage my day-to-day life and slowed my thoughts down so I could actually manage. The monologue that I've always had for my mind is, I imagine that, if I had a cap on my head and you could lift the top off and look at my brain, it's like a very busy intersection in New York where there's hundreds and hundreds of cars travelling back and forth. Everybody's tooting and no one's got a destination, and it's just going around and around. So medication helped slow that traffic jam down, I guess. So I guess for anyone questioning whether or not to take medication, I would just recommend them talking to a GP or talking to a health professional and really knowing what the side effects are, and they can make an informed decision about it. On the other hand, I think that there's a stigma now that medication, everyone's on an antidepressant these days. That's the norm. And I've had people say that to me. And again, I would just encourage people to be a little bit mindful with those sorts of statements that, sure, there might be lots of people taking medication for their mental health, but that doesn't mean that it makes that person's life any easier.
Are you hopeful that your condition will improve over time?
I am really hopeful. I know that OCD isn't curable, but it also doesn't mean that it has to define me. I'm someone who is really hopeful about life and wants to make the most out of life. And I know my experience of OCD will be a journey, and it will change over time, and there'll be hurdles, and there'll be easier times, and then there'll be, really difficult times. But I think that is life, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and make the most of it. So I'm also committed to being able to be a good advocate for other people that experience mental ill health, and to live true to that, to really live out my messages that, things can be really hard, and if it is hard, reach out, and it's okay to not be okay, but it doesn't mean that things won't get better.
Can you tell me about your project and your ambitions with it?
Yes. So OCD is a website and OCD resource that a good friend, Penny, and I started. And this was born out of a conversation, really. I remember I confided in Penny when I was recently diagnosed with OCD and really didn't know where to start. Where do I find information about this? And was struggling to find really approachable and Australian localised based information about OCD. And Penny and I joked that, oh well, we should just start something. And in the amazing way Penny does, she just turned and said to me, yeah, we should. And we did. So we created a website that is for people who have OCD or who want to learn more about it. It's called soocd.com.au, and it explores what OCD is, and it then talks about where people can find help and evidence-based treatments to support OCD. At this point in time, we have got written content, but we're also hoping to have videos of people with lived experience talking about OCD, because that's the thing that people want. They want to hear from other people who have a shared experience. Before Penny and I started So OCD, we thought, well, surely there's something Australian out there, or there's something that, you know, surely we're just missing something. And there'll be an OCD specific website. But again, and this is typical of what we're finding with OCD, is that it kind of gets lumped on to the end of any discussion about anxiety disorders. And when you go on to, you know, a mental health page, you know, there's anxiety, and then at the bottom, and then there's OCD, you know, this tiny kind of thing at the end. So we felt as though that wasn't enough. People need more information. And also wanted to dispel a lot of the myths that exist around OCD. One, you know, the name being a bit of a play on words, in that, you know, I'm so OCD about my fridge being perfectly clean. If that's the case for people, then that must be really hard, keeping their fridge clean, and I feel for them. But a lot of the time it gets thrown around as an adjective that someone's OCD. So actually trying to highlight to people that it is a debilitating mental illness. But also that we want to have So OCD as a conversation starter. We want to talk about it. We want to dispel the myths that exist around it. And really the only way to build community understanding is by sharing experience. So that's why we started it.